My name is Savannah and I am 28. To most people, that age represents the prime of life, a time of building careers and finding oneself. But for me, it felt like the edge of a cliff. I was living in a cramped, drafty studio apartment in the city, working to dead-end jobs just to keep the lights on, and constantly feeling the crushing weight of my family's collective disappointment. You see, in the eyes of the Miller family, I was the resident failure. My older brother, Marcus, was a high-flying corporate lawyer with a pristine condo and a Tesla. My younger sister, Chloe, was the golden child finishing her residency at a top-tier hospital. Then there was me, the girl who studied art history, only to end up waitressing and doing freelance graphic design for clients who rarely paid on time. The family group chat was a constant stream of Marcus's golf trips and Chloe's medical breakthroughs, punctuated by my mother's thinly veiled jabs at my lifestyle. They didn't just ignore me, they treated me like a cautionary tale. But there was one person who never looked at me with that cold, judgmental flicker in her eyes. My grandmother, Evelyn. She lived alone in the small, weathered house where she had raised my father and my Aunt Sarah, a place filled with the scent of dried lavender and the ticking of a grandfather clock that hadn't kept the right time since the 90s. While the rest of the family saw her as a stubborn relic of the past who refused to move into a high-end assisted living facility, I saw her as my only sanctuary. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in November. The rain was lashing against my window, and I was staring at my bank account balance on my phone. It was $500.12. That was it. That was my entire life's work, meant to cover my rent, my groceries, and my gas for the next 2 weeks. Then my phone buzzed. It wasn't the group chat. It was a direct call from Grandma Evelyn. Her voice was thin, a brittle threat of sound that made my heart drop into my stomach. She told me she was feeling dizzy, that her heart was fluttering like a trapped bird, and that she had run out of her heart medication. She didn't have the strength to drive to the pharmacy, and the local delivery service was closed for the holiday weekend. She sounded scared, and Evelyn was never scared. I immediately did what any rational person would do. I opened the family group chat and typed out a frantic message, explaining that Grandma was sick and needed someone to get her medicine right away. My father replied within minutes, but not with help. He told me that Grandma was always exaggerating for attention and that he was in the middle of a charity gala and couldn't be disturbed. My Aunt Sarah was even worse. She sent a voice note that I can still hear in my nightmares. She said that Mother has lived a long life and we shouldn't be expected to drop everything every time she has a sniffle, adding that she had already lived long enough and nature should just take its course. Marcus and Chloe didn't even bother to reply. They just liked my father's message about the gala. The cruelty of it felt like a physical blow. I looked at my $500. I looked at the GPS on my phone. Grandma lives 650 kilometers away. It was an 8-hour drive through a brewing storm. My car was a beat-up sedan with a flickering check engine light and tires that had seen better days. If I went, I would spend nearly half of my remaining money on gas and supplies. I would likely lose my shift at the restaurant the next morning, which would probably get me fired. I stood in my tiny kitchen, the silence of my apartment feeling deafening, and I realized that if I didn't go, no one would. My family was prepared to let an 80-year-old woman suffer alone because she was no longer convenient to their schedules or their images of success. I grabbed my coat, threw a few changes of clothes into a duffel bag, and emptied my meager savings at the gas station down the street. The drive was a descent into a gray, watery hell. The highway was slick with rain, and the wind buffeted my small car, threatening to push it off the road. Every time I hit a pothole, I prayed the axle wouldn't snap. I drank bitter black coffee from gas stations and kept my eyes glued to the white lines on the asphalt. My mind was racing. I thought about the way my mother always told me I was too emotional, how my father said I lacked the grit to succeed in the real world. Yet here I was, The failure, the only one willing to navigate a storm for the woman who gave them everything. As the hours ticked by, the terrain changed from urban sprawl to dark, looming forests and rolling hills. By the time I pulled into Grandma's gravel driveway, it was nearly 4 in the morning. The house was dark, save for a single lamp flickering in the living room window. I let myself in with the spare key hidden under the ceramic gnome on the porch. The house was cold. I found Evelyn sitting in her high-backed armchair, wrapped in 3 blankets, her face as pale as parchment. She looked so small, so fragile, that I burst into tears the moment I saw her. I didn't care about the money, or the job, or the 500 kilometers. I just cared that she was still breathing. I spent the next hour warming up some broth, getting her some water, and making sure she took the emergency sample of medication she had found in the back of her cabinet. I stayed by her side, rubbing her cold hands until the color began to return to her cheeks. She didn't say much at first, just watched me with those sharp, observant blue eyes that seemed to see right through the fatigue and the desperation I was trying to hide. I told her I was sorry it took so long, and I told her I was sorry the others didn't come. She just patted my hand and whispered that she knew exactly who would show up and who wouldn't. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, weak light over the frost-covered yard, Evelyn sat up a bit straighter. She looked at me and asked how much money I had left. I tried to lie, tried to tell her I was doing fine, but she knew. I confessed that I had spent my last $500 to get there. She nodded slowly, not with pity, but with a strange kind of grim satisfaction. Then, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She told me to look at the numbers. I thought it was a grocery list, or perhaps a prescription. It was a lottery ticket. She told me that 2 days ago, she had watched the drawing on the local news. She told me she had won the jackpot, not a small prize, not a few $1,000s, but the massive, multi-state jackpot that had been all over the headlines. $333 million. My jaw dropped, and I felt a lightheadedness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. I asked her why she called the family for help if she was sitting on a fortune. Why play the part of the damsel in distress? She leaned in close, her voice suddenly firm and devoid of the frailty I'd heard on the phone. She said that she needed to know the truth before she changed our lives forever. She said she was testing us. She wanted to see who loved her and who loved the idea of her inheritance. She told me that by driving through that storm with my last cent, I had passed the only test that mattered, and that the rest of the family had just signed away their right to a single penny of her heart and her fortune. The sun had fully climbed over the horizon now, bathing the dusty living room in a surreal, golden light that made the $333 million ticket in my hand look like a hallucination. I stared at the numbers, then at my grandmother, then back at the ticket. The paper was thin and insignificant, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. My head was spinning. I thought about my bank account, which was likely sitting at a few dollars after the last gas station fill up. And then I looked at this woman who had been treated like a burden by her own children for the last decade. She wasn't a burden. She was the most powerful person in our family, and nobody else knew it. Evelyn watched me process the reality of the situation with a calm that was almost unnerving. She told me that she had bought the ticket on a whim at the corner store while picking up her mail, never truly expecting anything to come of it. But when the numbers matched, she didn't feel joy. Instead, she felt a profound sense of clarity. She realized that her wealth would become a predator's lure for my father and Aunt Sarah. She knew that if she announced the win immediately, they would be at her doorstep with fake smiles and sudden concerns for her health, hovering like vultures waiting for a piece of the prize. She needed to know who they really were when there was nothing to gain. She explained to me that the phone call about her heart medication wasn't a total lie. She had felt unwell, but she had enough medicine to last until the pharmacy opened on Monday. The plea for help was a calculated move. She had called my father first, then Sarah, and then me. She had kept a notebook by her chair, recording their responses word for word. She showed it to me. There, in her neat, looping cursive, were the transcripts of their cruelty. My father had told her he was too busy with his social standing to care about her heart. Sarah had literally written her off as a woman who had outlived her usefulness. Seeing those words written down in Grandma's steady hand made the betrayal feel even more jagged and raw. I felt a surge of anger on her behalf that surpassed my own exhaustion. I told her that they didn't deserve her, and she smiled a small, said smile and agreed. But then her expression shifted. It sharpened into something I had never seen before, a look of calculated intent. She told me that the test wasn't over. She hadn't claimed the prize yet, and she didn't want the world to know she had it until she had finished teaching the rest of the family a lesson they would never forget. She wanted me to be her accomplice. She wanted to see how far their greed and their disdain would go if they thought she was truly at death's door and completely destitute. For the next few days, I stayed at the house, acting as her primary caretaker. We called a lawyer she trusted, an old friend from the city who came out under the guise of being a traveling insurance salesman so as not to alert the neighbors. Together, they set up a blind trust and began the process of claiming the winnings anonymously. Meanwhile, I was tasked with the most difficult part of the plan, maintaining the facade. I had to call the family group chat again. Grandma instructed me to tell them that she had taken a turn for the worse and that the house was falling into disrepair. I was to tell them that I was broke and couldn't afford to keep her there, and that we needed everyone to chip in for her care or help clear out the house so it could be sold to pay for a low-cost state nursing home. When I sent the message, the response was immediate and vitriolic. My mother called me within seconds, not to ask about Grandma's health, but to scream at me for trying to guilt-trip them. She told me that it was my choice to drive down there and that I shouldn't expect them to bail me out of my own impulsive decisions. Aunt Sarah messaged the group saying that the house was a dump anyway, and that if Grandma couldn't afford her own life anymore, she should have planned better. Marcus actually had the audacity to send a link to a government-run facility with a 1-star rating, suggesting we move her there because it was covered by her basic insurance and wouldn't cost the family a dime. The callousness was breathtaking. They were wealthy people. Marcus spent more on a weekend in Vegas than what it would cost to fix Grandma's roof and hire a nurse for a year. Chloe's designer handbag collection could have funded a decade of high-end care, but they refused to give a single cent to the women who had helped pay for their educations and held the family together after Grandpa died. Grandma sat in her chair, listening to me read the messages aloud, her face a mask of iron. She told me to invite them all over for a final dinner. She told me to tell them that she was giving up, that she was going to sign over the deed to the house to whoever wanted to deal with it, and that there were some family heirlooms she wanted to distribute before she was moved to the state home. That was the bait. The mention of heirlooms and the deed to the property changed their tune instantly. Even though they called the house a dump, the land it sat on had increased in value significantly over the years. Suddenly, everyone was available. My father, Marcus, Sarah, and Chloe all agreed to come down the following Saturday. They didn't come to see their mother or their grandmother. They came to scavenge. They came to make sure that if there was anything left of value in that old house, they would get their hands on it before the state took it. During the days leading up to the dinner, Grandma and I worked tirelessly. We weren't cleaning or cooking. We were preparing the stage. She had me go to the local thrift store and buy the most tattered, faded clothes I could find for her to wear. We moved the nice furniture into the garage and replaced it with old, mismatched pieces from the attic. We made the house look like the residence of someone who had truly hit rock bottom. It was an exhausting performance, and my heart ached every time I saw her sitting in a broken down chair. But she was energized. There was a fire in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. She told me that the truth is a bitter pill, but it's the only thing that cures the full. I also had to manage my own life, which was falling apart. My boss at the restaurant had indeed fired me for missing my shifts. I was officially unemployed and down to my last $40 after buying groceries for the house. When I told Grandma, she tried to give me money from a small emergency stash she kept in a tea tin. But I refused. I told her I wanted to see this through exactly as I was the broke, failing granddaughter they all despised. I wanted them to see me at my lowest, so they could show me exactly how little I meant to them. On Saturday afternoon, the parade of luxury vehicles began to pull into the muddy gravel driveway. My father's black Mercedes led the way, followed by Sarah's Range Rover and Marcus's Tesla. They stepped out of their cars looking like they were attending a funeral for someone they didn't particularly like. They were dressed in designer wool coats and polished boots, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of the weather-beaten house. I met them at the door, wearing a stained sweatshirt and looking as haggard as I felt. My mother didn't even say hello. She just pushed past me, complaining about the smell of the old wood and the humidity. The tension in the living room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Grandma was sitting in her armchair, looking small and defeated in her thrift store sweater. The family gathered around her, but they didn't sit close. They stood in a semicircle, looking down at her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a human being. Marcus was already looking at his watch, mentioning that he had a dinner reservation back in the city at 8. Sarah was eyeing a small silver tea set on the mantel, probably calculating its resale value. My father was the first to speak. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He asked about the deed. He told her that he had already spoken to a real estate agent and that they could probably get a decent price for the lot if they tore the house down immediately. He had the papers in his briefcase, ready for her to sign. Grandma looked at him, her eyes watering our performance that was so convincing I almost believed it myself. She asked him if he would at least stay for the meal I had prepared. She said it was the last time she would be able to cook for them, or rather, the last time I would be able to cook for them with what little we had left. The dinner was a scene of calculated misery. I served a thin, flavorless vegetable soup and stale bread on chipped plates. I watched as Chloe picked at her food with a look of pure disgust, while Marcus talked loudly on his phone about a merger he was closing. They didn't speak to Grandma. They spoke over her, discussing which nursing home was the cheapest and how they would split the proceeds from the land sale. They treated me like a servant, asking me to get them water or clear their plates without a single thank you. They mocked my career choices, with Sarah laughing about how my art degree was finally being put to use as a nurse's aide for a woman who couldn't pay me. Throughout the meal, I kept my head down, recording everything on my phone, which was hidden in a bowl of fruit on the sideboard. I wanted every sneer, every insult, and every cold-blooded calculation captured. I looked at Grandma, and she gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was set. They had no idea that they were currently being judged by a woman with more wealth than all of them combined. They had no idea that their behavior over the next hour would determine the course of the rest of their lives. As we moved back into the living room for the distribution of the heirlooms, the atmosphere shifted from boredom to predatory hunger. This was what they had come for. They expected jewelry, old coins, perhaps some hidden stocks. They didn't know that the only thing they were about to receive was a mirror held up to their own ugly souls. Grandma looked at each of them in turn, her expression softening into a mask of fox resignation. She told them she had 5 envelopes, one for each of them. She said that inside these envelopes was her legacy. My father took his with a smirk. Marcus grabbed his with a look of entitlement, and Sarah and Chloe followed suit. I was given the final envelope. They all tore them open at once, expecting checks or titles. Instead, they found something else entirely. They found copies of the messages they had sent me over the last week. They found the transcripts of their own words, their own denials of help, and their own wishes for her life to hurry up and end. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain starting to fall again on the tin roof. The silence in the room was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the oxygen right out of our lungs. My father stared at the printed screenshot of his own text message, the one where he said Grandma was exaggerating for attention and that he couldn't be bothered because of a galler. His face turned a deep, muddled purple, a mixture of embarrassment and rising anger, and Sarah dropped her paper as if it had burned her fingers, her mouth hanging open like a landed fish. For a few seconds, the only sound was the ticking of that old grandfather clock, which seemed to be mocking them with every passing second. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his voice sharp and defensive. He asked what kind of sick joke this was and why he was being forced to look at old text messages when they were supposed to be discussing the estate. He looked at me with pure venom, accusing me of poisoning Grandma's mind and turning her against her own children just because I was a failure who wanted a bigger slice of the pie. He called me a manipulator and a parasite, claiming that I had cherry-picked those messages to make them look bad. He didn't realize that I didn't have to cherry-pick anything. Their own words were an indictment that required no editing. Then Grandma spoke. Her voice wasn't the thin, wavering whistle it had been all week. It was resonant, clear, and carried a weight of authority that silenced Marcus instantly. She stood up from her chair without a struggle, discarding the tattered blanket as if it were a sheepskin. She told them that the messages weren't a joke, but a testament. She told them that she had spent 80 years building a family, believing that love and loyalty were the foundations of the Miller name, only to realize in her final years that she had raised a brood of strangers who valued her life only in terms of what it could be traded for. She looked my father directly in the eye and told him that she remembered when he was a boy and he was afraid of the dark, and how she had sat by his bed for weeks. She reminded Sarah of the time she had bailed her out of debt 20 years ago without telling us all. She went down the line, reminding them of the decades of quiet support, both emotional and financial, that she had provided. And in return, when she asked for a simple favor during a moment of health crisis, they had treated her like an expired coupon. The room erupted. My father started shouting that they were busy people with real responsibilities, and like me, and that she had no right to judge them for having lives. Sarah started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration, because she realized the silver tea set might be slipping through her fingers. Chloe, the doctor, had the nerve to say that from a clinical perspective, Grandma's behavior was showing signs of paranoia, and that perhaps they should look into having her declared incompetent so they could manage her affairs properly. The sheer coldness of her suggestion made my blood run cold. They weren't just indifferent. They were willing to strip her of her humanity to protect their interests. Grandma just laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. She told them that they were too late for that. She informed them that she had been seen by 3 independent psychologists the day before, all of whom had certified her as being of perfectly sound mind and body. She then reached into the side pocket of her chair and pulled out a second set of envelopes. These were thick, legal-sized, and bore the gold embossed seal of a very prestigious law firm in the city. She told them that these were their final gifts. They opened them slowly this time, the bravado starting to leak out of the room. Inside were legal notices, not of an inheritance, but of a total severance. Grandma had spent the last few days working with her lawyer to ensure that every single one of them was removed from her will, her life insurance, and any trusts that still carried her name. But it went further than that. She had been the silent guarantor on Marcus's business loan for his latest venture. She had been the primary owner of the vacation home Sarah used every summer. She was withdrawing it all. She was calling in the favors, pulling the rug out from under their carefully constructed lives. As they realized the magnitude of what was happening, the desperation turned into a frenzy. My mother started screaming at me, accusing me of brainwashing an old woman. She tried to lung toward me, but I didn't flinch. I just stood there, holding my phone, recording every second of their meltdown. My father tried to play the role of the reasonable son, kneeling by Grandma's chair and telling her that they were just stressed and didn't mean what they said. He tried to take her hand, but she pulled it away with a look of pure disgust. She told him that a man who only loves his mother when his bank account is threatened is no son of hers. The climax of the evening came when Marcus, red-faced and shaking, demanded to know how she expected to survive. He pointed at the peeling wallpaper and the mismatched furniture, sneering that she was a broke old woman who was throwing away the only people who could keep her out of a gutter. He told her she was delusional if she thought I could take care of her with my waitressing tips. He said she would be begging them for help within a month, and when she did, they wouldn't answer the phone. That was the moment Grandma looked at me and signaled that the performance was over. I went to the hallway and brought back the local newspaper from that morning, along with the official confirmation from the Lottery Commission. I laid them on the coffee table. The headline was about the unclaimed $333 million win, and right next to it was the letter from the trust Evelyn had formed. She told them the truth. She told them that she was the winner. She told them she had more money than all of them combined would earn in 10 lifetimes. The shift in the room was instantaneous and nauseating. The anger vanished, replaced by a terrifying, wide-eyed greed. My father's knees actually buckled. Sarah stopped crying and started smoothing her hair, her eyes darting toward the lottery confirmation like a hawk. Chloe started talking about how she could help Grandma find the best private specialists in the world. Marcus, who had just been screaming insults, suddenly had a smile so fake it looked painful. He called her Queen Evelyn and tried to make a joke about how they were all just playing a big game of family pranks. They started apologizing all at once, a cacophony of sycophantic excuses. They said they were joking, that they knew she was testing them, and that they had passed because they showed up, didn't they? They tried to hug her, tried to touch her, tried to reclaim their place in her orbit. It was the most pathetic display of human nature I had ever witnessed. They didn't care that they had hurt her. They only cared that they had insulted a billionaire. Grandma stood her ground, her face like granite. She told them to get out. She told them that the test was over the moment they opened the first envelopes. The second part, the revelation of the money, wasn't an invitation to reconcile. It was a punishment. She wanted them to know exactly what they had lost because of their cruelty. She wanted them to wake up every morning for the rest of their lives knowing that they were one phone call of kindness away from a life of unimaginable wealth. But because they couldn't find an ounce of compassion for a sick old woman, they would get nothing. She told my father that his Mercedes was being repossessed because she was withdrawing her collateral. She told Sarah that she had 48 hours to vacate the vacation home. She told Marcus his business partners would be receiving a call about his lack of financial backing. She was systematically dismantling the prestige they had used to look down on me and her. They pleaded, they begged, and eventually, when they realized she wouldn't budge, they turned ugly again. They shouted curses as they were ushered out of the house by the two private security guards Grandma had hired to wait in the kitchen. The sound of their luxury cars peeling out of the gravel driveway faded into the night. The house became incredibly still. I looked at Grandma, and she looked exhausted, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there for years. She looked at me and told me that I was the only one who didn't ask about the money, even after I knew it existed. I told her I didn't care about the millions. I was just glad she was okay. She smiled and told me that was exactly why the money was now as much mine as it was hers. She handed me a final document. It was a legal transfer. She had set up a separate trust in my name, funded with $50 million. Effective immediately. She told me I was no longer the family failure. She told me to go back to the city, pay off my debts, and buy the art gallery I had always dreamed of. But more than that, she asked me to stay with her for a while, to help her figure out how to use the rest of the money to do some actual good in the world. Far away from the toxic influence of the rest of the Miller family, I sat on the floor at her feet, the weight of the last few days finally crashing down on me. I thought about the $500 I had spent and how it had turned into $50 million. But more importantly, how it had saved my soul from the bitterness that had consumed my parents and siblings. We sat there in the quiet of the old house, two women who had been underestimated and ignored, now holding the keys to a kingdom. The revenge was sweet, but the peace was better. If you are enjoying this story of justice and seeing the greedy get exactly what they deserve, please take a moment to support the channel. This journey is about more than just money. It is about the quiet strength of those who do the right thing when no one is watching. Please subscribe to my channel, My Calm Revenge, for more stories where the underdog finally comes out on top and the truth always finds its way to the light. Your support helps us bring these tales of vindication to life. The aftermath of that night felt like waking up in a different universe. For years, I had lived with the constant delusion of being not enough, a person defined by the lack of zeros in my bank account and the lack of respect from my kin. But as the first week of our new reality unfolded, I realized that wealth of this magnitude isn't just about the things you can buy. It is about the silence you can finally afford. The phone calls from my father, my mother, and my siblings were relentless at first. They ranged from sobbing apologies to vitriolic threats of lawsuits. My father left a 14-minute voicemail claiming that grandma was being elder abused by me and that he would have me arrested for kidnapping her. I didn't even listen to the whole thing. I simply handed my phone to the legal team grandma had retained, and within 24 hours, a series of cease and desist orders were served. Grandma and I decided to leave the old house for a while. It held too many memories of the vultures circling, and she wanted to see the ocean. We didn't fly commercial. We didn't even look at prices. We packed a few bags, and a private car took us to a coastal estate she had purchased through the trust. Sitting on a balcony overlooking the Pacific, Grandma looked younger than she had in decades. She told me that the greatest burden she ever carried wasn't poverty or age, but the hope that her children would eventually become good people. Now that she had let go of that hope, she felt light as a feather. She spent her mornings talking to investment bankers not about how to grow her wealth, but how to give it away to causes that mattered: rural healthcare, elderly advocacy, and art scholarships for kids who were told their dreams were useless. I watched the destruction of my family's ego from a distance, like watching a controlled demolition, because Grandma had withdrawn her financial support and her name as a guarantor. The house of cards they had built began to tumble. Marcus was the first to fall. Without Grandma's collateral, his bank called in his business loans. He had been over-leveraged for years, living a lifestyle funded by debt and the expectation of a massive inheritance. Within 3 months, his Tesla was gone, his condo was on the market, and he was facing a massive fraud investigation for the way he had inflated his assets. He sent me a message on an old social media account begging for $5,000 just to cover his legal fees. I didn't block him. I just left it on read, letting the blue checkmark be the only response he would ever get from me again. And Sarah fared no better. The vacation home she had treated as her own for 20 years was sold, and the proceeds were donated to a local homeless shelter in her town. She tried to stage a protest at the property, claiming she had squatters' rights, but she was removed by security in front of all her high society friends. The embarrassment was the one thing she couldn't survive. She moved into a small apartment and took a job at a department store, the very kind of job she used to mock me for having. My sister Chloe tried to maintain her distance, thinking her medical career would save her, but the hospital found out about her comments regarding Grandma's competency and the potential for elder abuse. Well, she didn't lose her license. Her reputation in the prestigious circle she craved was tarnished beyond repair. She was no longer the golden child. She was just another doctor with a dark family secret. As for me, I didn't go out and buy a mansion or a fleet of supercars. The first thing I did with my portion of the money was go back to the restaurant where I had been fired. I walked in during the lunch rush, found the manager who had yelled at me for leaving to save my grandmother, and I handed him a check. It wasn't for him. It was a check for every single member of the kitchen and waitstaff, enough to cover their salaries for a year. I told them they deserved a boss who respected them. Then, I bought the building. I didn't fire the manager. I just made sure he knew that I was now his landlord and that any further mistreatment of his staff would result in his immediate termination. The look on his face was worth more than the $50 million sitting in my account. I eventually opened that gallery I had dreamed of, but it wasn't a pretentious space for the elite. It was a community hub where struggling artists could show their work for free, and where all the proceeds went back into the local neighborhood. I named it the Evelyn. My grandmother attended the opening, looking radiant in a simple silk dress. She didn't look like a woman who had won the lottery. She looked like a woman who had won her life back. People asked her how she felt about her children being absent from such a grand occasion. She would just smile and say that she had all the family she needed right here. The most profound change, however, was internal. I realized that the $500 I had used to drive those 650 kilometers wasn't a sacrifice. It was an investment in my integrity. If I hadn't gone, if I had listened to my father and stayed in my apartment, I might have eventually inherited a small portion of that money after Grandma passed away. But I would have inherited it as one of the vultures. I would have been just like them, hollow, greedy, and forever waiting for someone else to die so I could live. By choosing love over logic, I had saved the only part of myself that couldn't be bought. One evening, about a year after the win, I received a letter from my mother. It wasn't an apology. It was a long, rambling list of all the things she felt she was owed for the years she spent raising me. She even included the cost of my childhood braces. She asked for a meeting, just the two of us, to settle the accounts. I showed the letter to Grandma. She took it, folded it into a paper airplane, and sailed it off the balcony into the ocean breeze. She told me that some people are so poor that all they have is money, and even when they lose that, they still don't have a soul. We never replied to the letter. We spent our days traveling, learning, and building a legacy that had nothing to do with the Miller name and everything to do with the bond we shared. We found a small village in the mountains where we funded the construction of a new school and a medical clinic, ensuring that no one would ever have to go without medication because they couldn't afford a drive or a delivery. We did it anonymously under the name of the trust. There was no need for statues or plaques. The knowledge that we were changing lives was the only reward we needed. Every time I look at my bank balance now, I don't see numbers. I see the face of my grandmother in the dim light of that storm-tossed night. I see the moment her eyes cleared and she realized she wasn't alone in the world. Revenge is often thought of as a sharp, loud thing, a sudden blow, or a public shaming. But my calm revenge was different. It was the slow, steady process of living a beautiful, meaningful life while the people who tried to break us were forced to watch from the outside. They are still out there, bitter and broken, blaming the world for their misfortune. But Grandma and I, we are at peace. We know that the greatest wealth isn't found in a lottery ticket, but in the courage to show up when the world tells you to stay home. I am Savannah. I am 29 now, and I am the architect of a future that my family can't even imagine. I have my gallery, I have my grandmother, and I have the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I am exactly who I was always meant to be. The $500 is gone, but the lesson it bought me will last forever. We are happy, we are healthy, and we are finally free from the shadows of people who never deserved our light. Like and subscribe to our channel My Calm Revenge for more updates.